Hey guys, the Comsh here today to talk with you about some of the new Blackrock cards. Sorry if my voice is a little bit raspy. I just had my appendix pulled out and the breathing tube gave me a little bit of a sore throat. But hopefully it's fine. You guys can understand me and everything. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the cards. So first we have Dragon's Breath. This is a pretty interesting discount mechanic. We'll see it on another card we're going to talk about in a little bit. These cards are all going to cost one less per minion dead. They're basically like free late game cards rather than cards you ramp into. Like you don't get to cast this on turn 3 by trading minions as much as you do late in the game, where minions sort of die naturally or trade, and you get to cast this for free sort of on turn 7 rather than faster on things like turn 3. This one in particular doesn't seem that great. So like any of the aggressive mage decks like Mech Mage, Tempo Mage, even Flood Mage, they don't want their creatures to die as much, and they have limited slots that they want to use to play things like Frostbolt or Fireball that are more efficient, less conditional burn than this. You could try to build around this card with things like Violet Teacher or Imp Master, and then like sack all your dudes. But I think that deck needs a little bit more of these types of discount cards than we have right now. In addition, things like Freeze Mage probably don't want this just because they have more efficient burn. And Freeze Mage doesn't really want to clear the board and burn the same turn usually. They want to keep the board clear, then Alexstrasza, and then start burning their opponent out. So I don't know that this card fits in any existing decks right now. It has a little bit of constructed potential just if it gets built around in some sort of like miracle mage deck where you try to trade off a little bit and play some of the discount cards. But right now, I don't think it's too great constructed. In Arena, you're going to be trading a lot, so this is an okay removal spell, but you probably can't cast it as early as like Shadow Bolt, because you usually play minions on turn 2, and sometimes those won't trade. They'll be like 2/3s that bounce off each other. So this is probably fine in Arena, but it's not that great of a removal spell, and it'll disappoint you sometimes. So moving on, we have Blackwing Corruptor. If you can consistently trigger the holding a dragon mechanic with this card is insane because it's the same effect as Fire Elemental for one less mana and one less point of stats. Fire Elemental is played in like almost every Shaman deck, and this is neutral, so I think this is definitely going to get played in any of the holding dragon decks or the dragon themed decks. So this card is amazing, but it remains to be seen how good the dragon decks will be. They're definitely gaining some powerful tools like this card and some others, Blackwing Technician. So if that deck becomes good, this will be one of the all-stars in that deck. Just sort of like how Blast Mage is an all-star in Mech Mage. So this card is very good, has a lot of real constructed potential. The stats are good, the ability is great if you can trigger it. So, a very solid card. If you don't get to trigger this that often, then this is like worse Booty Bay Bodyguard most of the time. So the stats for the mana cost without the ability aren't enough to justify just playing this. So you definitely want to be triggering the dragon mechanic, holding a dragon mechanic a lot. So in Arena, if you don't get to grab that many dragons, which I think will often be the case, this card is going to be pretty bad. So good and constructed, pretty bad in Arena. Moving on, we have Draconid Crusher. And it's nice to see that we're getting some mid-range dragons, because before this, all the dragons we had cost like 4 or less, or like 9 plus. So it's nice to see that we're getting some mid-range dragons. They're definitely something that the holding dragon / dragon tribal deck needs. This provides a BGH target in dragon decks, and you want as many BGH targets as possible, so if they use it on things like this, and your big dragons get to stay alive. 6 mana 9/9 is definitely quite strong. But this is hard to trigger when you're playing like a controlling deck, just because you're not going to be damaging your opponent as much as try to stay alive. Against aggro decks like Face Hunter, this is going to be a pretty dead card, just because if you're staying alive long enough to bash your opponent down and play things like this, you've already won. And if you're like trying to stay alive, a 6 mana 6/6 really isn't going to help that much. So this is probably at its best in like a mid-range, maybe Dragon Tribal deck. It's probably too expensive for an aggro deck unless you're playing like really high curve Zoo, maybe in mid-range Hunter, but it's just doesn't really do that much of what an aggro deck wants, and also costs quite a bit. The good thing is opponent can't silence this that efficiently because it still leaves behind a 6/6, which is decent. It's quite good against anybody playing a Warlock deck since they tap and then they heal. So before they play like a heal bot or something, you can play this, make it big, and even if they heal up, you get to keep a 9/9. So I think this has some constructed potential, but it's meta dependent. If everybody's running aggressive decks, this card's probably going to be pretty bad. But this could fit into some of the mid-range Dragon Tribal decks. because it has the potential to be really big. So as a 6/6 for 6 with upside in Arena, it's probably pretty good there. So this card has a little bit of constructed potential, although it's really bad against some decks, good against others, and it's probably pretty good in Arena. Moving on, we have Volcanic Drake. This is the other card with discount for each minion that died mechanic. This is another 6-mana dragon, so again fulfills that sort of mid-range dragon role, mid-cost that the dragon decks need. This card is probably going to be free a lot of the time, like after a board clear. So if they print a lot of other like discount creatures like this, maybe like even Twisting Nether could become playable, where you just tap a lot with Warlock, and then you Twisting Nether, and then you play like Volcanic Drake, a bunch of other discount things for free. So that could be kind of a cool deck if they print more cards like this. But basically, you want to Flame Strike or trade all your minions in or something like that. Use all your mana, and then play like 2 Volcanic Drakes for free, and that's a really strong play. You usually wait till pretty late to play this card, so it's good with holding dragons. And again, with this mechanic, this is sort of a thing you dump free late game rather than something you like try to ramp into by trading. The stats are pretty good on this just because it kills Belcher without dying, and you can usually cast it for not that much. So this is pretty good in a mid-range deck. Definitely good in some sort of deck where you're trying to use a lot of your mana as a board clear and you want minions. This is pretty weak against classes that kill things during their turn, so like Freeze Mage that never really plays that many creatures and use like Doomsayers to wipe your board. This card's going to be pretty bad by default against those decks. It'll just be like a 6-mana 6/4, but that's not terrible because of the potential this card has against like other mid-range or control decks or aggro. So this is probably a pretty strong card. It doesn't need a dedicated deck, unlike Dragon's Breath, because it's just good when you trade or you clear, since most decks play AoE. So I think this has a lot of constructed potential. Arena is all about trading, so it's not that hard to make this cost less. So like on turn 7, you could trade a little bit, play like a 4-drop, and then this for 3. So that's a really strong use of 7 mana. Basically, you're getting a discounted large body with this card, and that's quite strong, as we've seen with Giants and things like that. And speaking of Giants, from a design standpoint, it's pretty interesting if we'll see a Giant with this mechanic, something like an 8/8 for 10 or 11 that costs 1 less for each creature that died. Since they are making this mechanic, it would be pretty interesting to see it on a Giant. It would definitely make the lots of board wipes decks and a bunch of discount creatures more viable. But overall, I think this card is great constructed and pretty good in Arena as well. So finally, we get to talk about the legendary that we've got, Nefarian. And Nefarian is a super sweet card. It does die to BGH, so it probably is best in either a warrior control deck or a ramp, possibly dragon-based druid deck. Plays a bunch of large dragons like Dr. Boom, because the thing about BGH right now is that you want to either have no targets, so their BGH is useless, or you want to have a ton of targets in your deck, since that reduces the efficacy of BGH. Since if you only have one target, then it'll just die to BGH. Your opponent will get that free value. If you have no targets, you blank it. But if you have a lot of targets, they usually will just BGH like on curve as soon as you play a BGH target. So they won't be able to save it for the best target. So if like they BGH your Dr. Boom, your Nefarian's going to survive. If they BGH your Alexstrasza, your Dr. Boom will survive, and so on and so forth. So if you're playing a lot of BGH targets like Control Warrior, this card will be able to stay alive a lot of the time. But even if this card dies, the effect is provides a lot of value. So most classes have both really good and really bad spells, so it is a little bit RNG based, but usually you'll end up with at least something you want to cast. 0 or 1 mana spells can be pretty powerful with Nefarian, because you can cast them in the same turn as you cast Nefarian. Just imagine like Nefarian and then double Totemic Might. The value is just so real. Although a lot of people already talked about this, and there's probably going to be highlight reels once the card is released, but it's really good against Warlock decks. Every Warlock deck plays Demons, and even most play Jiraxxus with Demon Lock and Handlock. So if you get Sacrificial Pact, you'll almost always have a target, and then you can play Nefarian once they have their Jiraxxus out, get Pact, and just kill Jiraxxus. So against Warlock, a lot of the time this card will be insane. Even if you don't pull Sacrificial Pact, you can get things like Siphon Soul, and just a lot of Warlock class spells are good against themselves. Like even Twisting Nether is insane against Handlock. This card is quite good against Warlock and some of the other classes. It can miss and get you some pretty bad spells, but then you're getting a 9 mana 8/8, and if you're playing the kind of deck we talked about with lots of BGH targets, it'll usually be able to survive. So this is a really good card, gives you card advantage. I think it'll be really good and constructed. It is a little bit on the expensive side for Arena, but it'll usually come close to winning the game if it sticks on the board. So it's probably pretty decent Arena as well. It's pretty cool and constructed. And one last thing to note, even if I'm like pretty horribly wrong about this card and it doesn't end up being great and constructed, the first few weeks it's released, people will still be playing it just because it's such a fun effect. That people will want to like test and play with this card. So even if it doesn't end up being that great, which I think it will, a lot of people are going to be testing this at every rank in Constructed and wanting to play with it. So it's definitely a card to look out for. Alright guys, those are the 5 cards that we've taken a look at so far. Feel free to provide feedback in the comments on YouTube or templestorm.com or shoot me an email. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.